The wind off the Chihuahuan desert carried the smell of creosote and dust through the barbed wire at 2 in the afternoon, and the prisoners stood in formation under a sky so wide it seemed to curve at the edges. They had been told, in whispered warnings aboard the transport ship and in the concrete belly of the processing center at Angel Island, that Americans were demons who ate the flesh of captured soldiers and hung their bones from trees. They had been told to die rather than surrender. But here they stood, 214 men in threadbare uniforms, squinting at a sign painted in crooked kanji that read "Welcome to Camp Lordsburg," and at a row of tables where American soldiers were handing out bottles of something brown and fizzing that caught the light like liquid amber. One man took a bottle, tipped it back, felt the carbonation sting his throat, and tasted sweetness he had not known in 18 months. The contradiction lived in that moment. The space between expectation and reality, between propaganda and the peculiar machinery of American abundance that would, over the next 3 years, reshape not just logistics and warfare, but the very psychology of captivity itself. This was New Mexico in the summer of 1943, and the war in the Pacific had entered a phase where the industrial capacity of the United States had begun to outpace not just production targets, but the imagination of those who set them. The prisoners arriving at Lordsburg and dozens of camps like it, scattered across Texas, Arizona, Colorado, Wyoming, had come from Guadalcanal, from Tarawa, from the Charnel Islands where jungle and coral drank blood by the gallon. They expected executions. They expected starvation. They expected the same treatment that Allied prisoners received in camps governed by the Kempeitai, where rice rations fell below subsistence, and men died with their ribs showing through skin like xylophone keys. Instead, they found mechanized kitchens, electric lights that burned all night, and a logistics apparatus so vast and so casual in its abundance that it seemed less like a military operation and more like an industrial magic trick. The cognitive dissonance was total. It was also strategic. The truck that brought them from the railhead in Deming rolled on tires made in Akron, burned gasoline refined in Tulsa, and carried a cargo capacity that exceeded the payload of 3 Imperial Army wagons. The driver, a corporal from Amarillo named Boone, chewed gum and listened to Bob Wills on a radio bolted under the dash. The road was paved. The prisoners noticed this. They noticed the telephone poles marching in perfect intervals toward the horizon, the irrigation pivots throwing silver arcs over cotton fields, the freight trains a mile long hauling ore and timber and livestock in a continuous mechanical river. One of the prisoners, a former schoolteacher from Niigata named Hayashi, kept a mental tally of electrical infrastructure, poles, transformers, substations, and lost count before they reached the camp. He would later write, in a letter cleared by censors and sent to a cousin in Brazil, that America had more electricity than people. The camp itself sat on alkaline hardpan where nothing grew except sagebrush and the occasional yucca stabbing up like a bayonet. Quonset huts formed rows beneath cottonwood trees that the army had planted 2 years earlier and kept alive with irrigation pulled from a well 200 feet deep. Each hut had bunks with mattresses, not straw pallets. Each had a coal stove for winter. There was a mess hall with steel trays and a kitchen where 3 cooks worked shifts around a Hobart mixer and a walk-in refrigerator that hummed day and night. There was a canteen that sold cigarettes, toiletries, writing paper, and Coca-Cola at 5 cents a bottle. There was a baseball diamond with real bases and a backstop made from scrap chain link. The latrine had flush toilets. The showers had hot water 3 days a week. The dissonance was not subtle. It was architectural. The processing began the morning after arrival. Delousing first, a necessity after weeks in ship holds. Then medical exams conducted by a captain named Lee Rosenberg, who had trained at Johns Hopkins and spoke serviceable Japanese, learned from a semester abroad in Kyoto, before the war made that fact quietly heroic and vaguely suspicious at the same time. She weighed each man, checked teeth, listened to lungs, noted malnutrition and beriberi and the scars of old shrapnel with the same clinical detachment she had used on draftees in Baltimore. Her call sign on camp radio was Doc 6, and she ran the infirmary like a teaching hospital, training medics and keeping logs that would later inform Allied planning for repatriation. She did not smile much. She did not need to. Her competence was its own language. The first meal was the second shock. Breakfast came on steel trays divided into sections. Scrambled eggs cooked in butter, toast, bacon, oatmeal with brown sugar, coffee with canned milk, and an orange. The portions were identical to what American soldiers ate. This was Geneva Convention protocol, but the prisoners did not know that. They knew only that the eggs were real, the bacon was crispy, and the orange was the first citrus most of them had seen since leaving Japan. Some men wept quietly. Others ate in silence, mechanical and suspicious, waiting for the cruelty to reveal itself. It did not. The next meal was the same, and the next. Within a week, the average prisoner had gained 4 pounds. The woman overseeing camp logistics was a first lieutenant named Frances Osgood, 31 years old, originally from a cattle ranch outside Abilene, Texas, where her father had run 2,000 head across 16 sections of drought-resistant mesquite grassland. She had studied agricultural economics at A&M, joined the WAC in 1942, and been assigned to internment operations because someone in personnel thought ranch girl translated to knows how to manage livestock. The casual sexism rankled, but she did not correct it. She simply ran the most efficient supply depot in the Southwest Theater. Her call sign was Longhorn, and her job was to ensure that every camp in the district, 4 facilities, 8,000 prisoners total, received food, medicine, fuel, clothing, mail, recreational supplies, and whatever else the Geneva Protocols required on time, every time without exception. She worked from a headquarters in El Paso, a converted warehouse with a dozen clerks, 6 typewriters, 2 telephones, and a wall covered in maps and logistics matrices that tracked rail schedules, truck routes, warehouse inventories, and requisition timelines. She had a knack for seeing bottlenecks before they formed. When a rail strike threatened to delay a shipment of winter coats, she rerouted through Santa Fe and had the trucks rolling within 6 hours. When a warehouse in Tucson burned and took 3 months of medical supplies with it, she reallocated from depots in Phoenix and Albuquerque, and no camp went without bandages. Her superiors called her efficient. Her peers called her the calculator. She called herself tired. The prisoners, meanwhile, began to adjust. The initial terror gave way to routine, and routine gave way to something stranger, comfort. They were assigned work details, as allowed under international law: agriculture, road maintenance, forestry, light manufacturing. The labor was hard but not punishing. They worked 8-hour shifts, received small stipends in camp scrip, and returned to barracks where mail call brought letters from home, delivered via the Red Cross with only minimal censorship. Some men wrote back. Others did not, convinced their families would be punished for contact with the disgraced. But the letters kept coming, and slowly, grudgingly, the prisoners began to believe they might survive. One detail was sent to a ranch 40 miles north of Lordsburg, owned by a man named Virgil Crane, who raised Herefords and grew alfalfa in the shadow of the Burro Mountains. Crane was 72, weathered as saddle leather, and had lost a grandson at Bataan. He did not hate the prisoners. He hated the war, and the distinction mattered. He put them to work irrigating fields, mending fences, and baling hay. He paid them in camp scrip and cold well water. He did not speak Japanese, and they did not speak English, but gestures sufficed. When the work was done, he handed out wide-brim straw hats to keep the sun off, the kind he bought by the dozen from a supplier in Juarez. The prisoners wore them like trophies. One afternoon, Crane opened a cooler and pulled out bottles of Coca-Cola, 6 of them, beaded with condensation. He handed them out without ceremony. The men drank in silence, standing in the shade of a cottonwood while a red-tailed hawk circled overhead. One of the prisoners, a corporal named Tanaka, later told the camp interpreter that this moment, the cold Coke, the hat, the sky, was when he first understood that the war was not a story about demons and heroes, but about men and systems, and that the system he had believed in had lied to him about which was which. The logistical machinery behind that Coke bottle was invisible to Tanaka, but central to Osgood's daily calculus. Coca-Cola had been declared essential to morale by the War Department in 1941, a designation that ensured production and distribution even under rationing. The company built 64 bottling plants overseas, from North Africa to the Pacific, and supplied the domestic front with a network of rail and truck routes that moved syrup concentrate and carbonation equipment with the same priority as ammunition. Osgood's depot in El Paso received 3 pallets of Coke every week, 1,800 bottles, which she divided among the camps according to population. Each prisoner was entitled to 1 bottle per week. The math was simple. The symbolism was not. The propaganda value of abundance was not lost on Allied command. Newsreel footage of POW camps, sanitized and staged, was released to neutral countries and monitored for international reaction. The message was clear. America treated prisoners according to law, fed them from the same supply chain that fed its own soldiers, and did so with an industrial ease that suggested infinite capacity. This was psychological warfare of the subtlest kind. Every letter home, every Red Cross inspection report, every photograph of prisoners playing baseball or drinking Coke chipped away at the narrative that dying was preferable to capture. By late 1944, surrender rates among Japanese forces in the Pacific had begun, incrementally, to rise. Osgood saw this in the reports that crossed her desk. She saw the tonnage figures, the caloric intake charts, the medical improvement statistics. She saw the letters translated and filed in which prisoners described electric lights and flush toilets and meals with meat. She saw the strategic value, but she also saw the cost. Her brother, a B-24 navigator, had gone down over Rabaul in January and was presumed dead. She did not speak of this. She filed requisitions, answered phones, and kept the machine running because stopping was not an option and grief was a luxury she could not afford. The paradox lived in the gap between policy and perception. The Geneva Conventions required humane treatment, and the United States, conscious of its own prisoners in Japanese hands, adhered rigorously to protocol in the hope, naive as it turned out, of reciprocity. But reciprocity did not come. Reports filtered back through Red Cross channels and escaped POWs. Starvation rations, forced labor, summary executions, medical experiments. The Japanese Empire did not recognize the conventions. Its prisoners died at rates that would later be calculated at nearly 30%, 10 times the death rate in German camps. The asymmetry was stark. American camps offered Coke and baseball. Japanese camps offered cholera and shallow graves. This knowledge circulated quietly among the camp staff. It created a moral friction that had no easy resolution. Some guards grew bitter, wondering why they should feed the enemy well when American boys were dying of dysentery in Changi. Others, like Rosenberg, saw the treatment of prisoners as a measure of civilization, a line that separated policy from atrocity. Osgood did not philosophize. She calculated. She knew that every calorie delivered, every medical supply distributed, every letter processed was a data point in a larger equation that balanced military necessity, international law, and the simple arithmetic of logistics. She did not love the work. She was good at it, and in wartime, that was enough. By the spring of 1944, the camps had settled into a rhythm. Work details continued. Mail flowed in both directions. The canteen did steady business. A prisoner-run newspaper, censored but allowed, printed in Japanese and English, covered camp baseball scores, work assignments, and carefully worded editorials about life in America. The tone was neutral, observational, almost anthropological. One article described the mechanization of agriculture, noting that a single combine harvester could do the work of 60 men. Another described the American habit of drinking iced beverages year-round, a luxury enabled by refrigeration infrastructure that Japan, with its war economy, could not match. The subtext was clear. Even if the text was not, we are losing because they have more of everything, and they do not even notice. The prisoners began to learn English haltingly, through classes taught by a retired schoolteacher from Silver City who volunteered twice a week. The curriculum was basic: greetings, numbers, common phrases, but the effort was significant. Some men learned out of boredom. Others learned because they sensed dimly that the world after the war would not be the world they had left. The teacher, a widow named Mrs. Whitmore, brought cookies sometimes, homemade oatmeal raisin, and distributed them after class. This small kindness, repeated weekly, did more to erode the myth of American barbarism than any propaganda leaflet. One prisoner, a former engineer named Sato, began sketching plans for irrigation systems during his free time, adapting American techniques he observed on work details. He filled a notebook with diagrams of pivot irrigation, drip lines, and mechanized pumps, annotating them in Japanese with cost estimates and efficiency calculations. He did not know if he would ever return to Japan. He did not know if these plans would ever be built. But the act of designing them was itself a reclamation of agency, a refusal to let captivity define his identity. When Osgood saw the notebook during a routine inspection, she did not confiscate it. She asked the interpreter to tell Sato that his calculations looked sound. The air war, meanwhile, had escalated beyond recognition. By mid-1944, B-29s were flying from the Marianas, hitting targets in the Japanese home islands with incendiary payloads that turned cities into firestorms. The strategic calculus had shifted from precision strikes to area bombing, a doctrine that prioritized industrial disruption over surgical targeting. The prisoners heard about this through smuggled radio transcripts and censored letters. The news was abstract, distant, but the implications were personal. Their cities were burning, their families were dying, and they were safe in New Mexico, drinking Coke and playing baseball. The psychological dissonance deepened. Some men withdrew into silence. Others rationalized, telling themselves they had done their duty, that capture was fate, that survival was not dishonor. A few, very quietly, began to question the narratives they had been taught. If America was a nation of demons, why did it feed its prisoners? If the emperor was divine, why had he sent them to die on coral atolls without air support or resupply? The questions were dangerous, heretical, and they circulated in whispers during night, in the moments before sleep when the mind is too tired to lie to itself. Osgood saw the psychological reports compiled by the camp's intelligence officers, who monitored prisoners for signs of radicalization or collaboration. The reports noted the emergence of two factions: the diehards, who maintained loyalty to the emperor and enforced a code of silence and non-cooperation, and the realists, who accepted the logic of surrender and engaged with the camp system. The split was not clean. Loyalties were fluid, contingent, shaped by news from home and the daily texture of camp life. The intelligence officers wanted to exploit the split, to isolate the diehards and cultivate the realists as potential sources or future assets. Osgood's job was simpler: keep everyone fed, healthy, and accounted for. The politics were someone else's problem. But politics could not be entirely avoided. In July 1944, the War Department initiated a re-education program, euphemistically called orientation, designed to expose prisoners to American values and democratic principles. The program included film screenings, lectures, and discussions led by civilian educators and Nisei translators who had been recruited from the internment camps where Japanese Americans were being held, a bitter irony that was not lost on anyone. The film showed American industry, agriculture, labor unions, and political processes. The lectures covered history, civics, and economics. The discussions were awkward, stilted, and punctuated by long silences. Some prisoners attended out of curiosity. Others attended because non-attendance was noted and could result in reassignment to less desirable work details. A few, very few, attended because they wanted to understand how the nation that had defeated them functioned. Sato was one of these. He sat in the back of the mess hall during a screening of a documentary about the Tennessee Valley Authority, watching footage of dams and power plants and rural electrification projects that had transformed a region of subsistence farmers into an industrial powerhouse. He took notes. When the film ended and the lecturer asked for questions, Sato raised his hand and asked, in halting English, how much the project had cost and how long it had taken. The lecturer, surprised, answered, $7 billion, 12 years. Sato nodded and wrote it down. Osgood watched the orientation sessions when her schedule allowed. She found them strange and sad, an earnest attempt to explain democracy to men who had been taught that democracy was weakness, that individual rights were selfish, that sacrifice for the collective was the highest virtue. She did not know if the program worked. She suspected it did not, or at least not in the way its architects intended. You could not argue someone out of a worldview. But you could, perhaps, erode it quietly, with repeated exposure to contradictions. The food that kept coming, the letters that were not censored into meaninglessness, the electric lights that burned all night without rationing. The propaganda of abundance was the most effective kind because it required no argument. It simply was. The war ground on. In October 1944, American forces returned to the Philippines. The kamikaze campaign began, a desperate tactic born of material exhaustion and ideological fervor. Prisoners at Lordsburg learned of this through letters and radio transcripts, and the news landed with the weight of confirmation. The war was lost, but the dying would continue. Some men prayed for their comrades. Others stopped praying entirely. The diehards doubled down, insisting that divine intervention would still deliver victory. The realists said nothing and kept their heads down. Osgood's workload increased as the prisoner population swelled. New camps opened in Utah and Idaho. Existing camps expanded. The logistics became a three-dimensional puzzle: rail capacity, truck availability, warehouse space, fuel allocation, personnel rotation, medical supplies, winter clothing, food tonnage. She worked 16-hour days and slept in a cot in the back of the office. Her superiors recommended her for promotion. She declined. She did not want a desk in Washington. She wanted the war to end so she could go home to Abilene and forget that she had ever become good at this. In December, a prisoner at Lordsburg attempted suicide by hanging. He was cut down in time and revived in the infirmary, where Rosenberg sedated him and assigned a guard to watch him around the clock. The incident was logged, investigated, and attributed to despondency over family circumstances. His wife and 2 children had been killed in the firebombing of Tokyo. The man, once recovered, was transferred to a smaller camp in Colorado where the isolation might be less triggering. Rosenberg wrote the transfer order herself and did not sleep well for a week. The winter of 1944-45 was cold, even in New Mexico. Snow fell on the camp in thin dustings that melted by noon. The coal stoves in the Quonset huts burned constantly. The prisoners, issued wool coats and blankets, marveled at the surplus. In Japan, soldiers at the front were stripping coats from the dead. Here, there were extras in the warehouse. The contradictions piled up, one on top of another, until the cognitive scaffolding that had supported the old worldview began to creak and shift. By spring, the news from the Pacific was unambiguous. Iwo Jima had fallen. Okinawa was next. B-29s were flying round-the-clock missions, reducing Japanese cities to ash and rubble. The prisoners knew that the end was near. They did not know what it would look like: invasion, surrender, or annihilation. They lived in the liminal space of waiting, a psychological purgatory where the future was opaque and the past was a minefield of regret and rationalization. In May, Germany surrendered. The news rippled through the camps, carried by radio and rumor. The European war was over. The Pacific War, isolated now, would be the sole focus of American industrial and military power. The implications were clear: more bombers, more ships, more men, more tonnage, more of everything that had already proven overwhelming. The diehards insisted that Japan would fight to the last man. The realists quietly doubted it. Osgood received a letter from the Red Cross in June, confirming what she had known but not allowed herself to believe. Her brother's remains had been identified and would be returned after the war. She read the letter twice, folded it carefully, and placed it in a drawer. Then she returned to her desk and continued processing requisitions because the machine did not care about grief, and stopping was not an option. The atomic bombs fell in August and the war ended 9 days later. The announcement came over the radio in the camp mess hall during lunch and the room went silent. The prisoners did not cheer. The guards did not cheer. Everyone simply stopped and listened as the translator read the emperor's surrender speech, the words formal and archaic and devastating in their finality. The war was over. Japan had lost. The prisoners were now, officially, something other than prisoners but not yet free, a bureaucratic category awaiting definition. Repatriation took months. The logistics of returning thousands of prisoners across the Pacific, in a shipping network still clogged with military cargo and occupation forces, required the same kind of planning and coordination that Osgood had spent 3 years perfecting. She worked the problem methodically: manifests, transportation schedules, medical clearances, paperwork. The prisoners were processed in waves, grouped by health status and destination. The sick and wounded went first. The diehards went last, sequestered until the very end to prevent disruption. Saito was in the third wave, scheduled for departure in November. Before he left, he asked the interpreter if he could speak to Lieutenant Osgood. The request was unusual but not unprecedented. Permission was granted. They met in the logistics office, the interpreter standing between them, and Saito presented her with the notebook, the one filled with irrigation designs and efficiency calculations. He said, through the interpreter, that he wanted her to have it in case it was useful. Osgood accepted the notebook, thanked him, and wished him well. After he left, she paged through the sketches and annotations, marveling at the meticulous precision, the engineer's instinct to solve problems even in captivity. She filed the notebook in her personal effects and thought about it occasionally for the rest of her life. The camps emptied slowly, one wave at a time, until by early 1946 only a skeleton staff remained to decommission the facilities and process the final paperwork. Osgood stayed until the end because that was her nature. When the last prisoner boarded the last truck to the last railhead, she locked the office, turned in her keys, and caught a train to Abilene. She did not speak much about the war afterward. When people asked, she said she had worked in logistics, which was true, and left it at that. Rosenberg returned to Baltimore and opened a private practice. She treated veterans mostly, men who came back with wounds that were not always visible and stories they did not always tell. She never forgot the prisoners, the way they had looked when they arrived, hollow-eyed and starving, and the way they had looked when they left, heavier and quieter and carrying something like understanding. She did not romanticize the work. It had been necessary and she had done it well, and that was enough. The camps themselves were dismantled or repurposed. Lordsburg became a training facility for a few years, then was abandoned entirely, the Quonset huts sold as surplus, the land returned to sagebrush and silence. The baseball diamond remained for a while, the bases gone but the backstop still standing, until wind and rust brought it down. The cottonwood trees, irrigated and tended during the war, survived and grew tall, a green anomaly in the desert that hinted at a history the landscape otherwise erased. The prisoners returned to a Japan that was unrecognizable. The cities were rubble. The economy was shattered. The social structures that had defined their world, the military hierarchy, the divine emperor, the belief in inevitable victory had collapsed. Some men struggled to reintegrate, haunted by the dissonance between what they had expected and what they had experienced. Others adapted, using skills learned in the camps, English, agricultural techniques, mechanical knowledge, to rebuild. Saito worked as a civil engineer during the Reconstruction, designing irrigation systems for rural cooperatives, and occasionally thought about the wide sky over New Mexico and the cold bite of Coca-Cola on a hot afternoon. The legacy of the camps was complicated, contested, and impossible to reduce to a single narrative. To some, they were evidence of American magnanimity, a demonstration that even in war, the United States adhered to law and principle. To others, they were a propaganda tool, a cynical exercise designed to extract intelligence and demoralize the enemy. Both interpretations were true, and neither was complete. The reality was more prosaic. The camps were a logistical operation, executed with the same industrial efficiency that characterized every aspect of the American war effort. And they succeeded because the system was designed to succeed, because the resources were available, and because people like Osgood and Rosenberg did the work without asking whether it mattered in the grand scheme of things. The sky over the desert is wide and indifferent. It does not remember the men who stood beneath it, waiting to be told what came next. It does not remember the Quonset huts or the baseball diamond or the cottonwood trees that still stand, improbable and green, in a landscape defined by absence. But the men remembered. They remembered the contradiction between expectation and reality, between the stories they had been told and the world as it actually was. They remembered the Coca-Cola and the wide-brim hats and the electric lights that burned all night without rationing. They remembered that the enemy, when given the opportunity, chose law over cruelty, abundance over starvation, and that this choice, more than any battle or bombing campaign, revealed the true shape of power. The moral architecture of the camps was not simplicity. It was not kindness for its own sake. It was strategy, calculation, and adherence to principle under conditions where principle was optional. It was the decision, made 1,000 times over by people whose names are mostly forgotten, to treat human beings as human beings even when the war made it easy to do otherwise. That this decision was also advantageous, that it served propaganda and psychological warfare and long-term strategic goals, does not diminish it. If anything, it clarifies it. The camps succeeded because they aligned ethics with effectiveness, because the system that produced them was built on the understanding that abundance, properly deployed, was a weapon more powerful than scarcity. The prisoners learned this lesson slowly, reluctantly, against the grain of everything they had been taught. They learned it in the mess hall and the canteen, in the letters from home and the films about dams and power plants, in the quiet competence of people like Osgood and Rosenberg, who did not preach or proselytize, but simply did their jobs with a precision that spoke for itself. They learned that the war was not a contest between demons and heroes, but between systems, and that the system with more steel, more electricity, more food, more trucks, more logistical depth, and more institutional commitment to its own principles would win not because it was virtuous, but because it was inexhaustible. And in the end, when the prisoners went home and the camps were dismantled and the desert reclaimed the land, what remained was not bitterness or gratitude but something closer to comprehension. They had expected torture. They had received Coca-Cola. The gap between those two realities was the war in miniature, the distance between ideology and fact, between myth and machine. And if they told their children about it in the years after, they told it as a story about contradiction. The moment when the world they thought they understood revealed itself to be something else entirely, something larger and stranger and more relentlessly efficient than they had imagined possible. The sky was wide. The hats kept the sun off. And the war, mercifully, was over.